All right, welcome. We're so excited to be here. We have an awesome event for you tonight. We're really excited to do a screening of the Maury Island Incident, and we have the filmmaker, Steve Edmiston, here to give a brief introduction to the film, and then we're going to watch it, and then we'll do a Q&A afterwards and with Steve. And after that, we're going to do an alien open mic and share any of our own personal stories that we have. So I'm Krystal, and I'm just really grateful to have all of you here, and I hope you really enjoy what we're doing for you.
Oh, good. Lights right in my eyes. You always forget that part when you get on stage. My name is Steve Edmiston. Thank you for letting me come and share the film, Krystal and Universe on Earth. Very excited to do that. I don't think of myself as the filmmaker. I was the screenwriter on this film. I want to tell you a little bit about the film and making the film, and then maybe a tiny bit about how I went down this rabbit hole. This film was actually conceived in 2012. It was shot in 2014. It's played film festivals, certainly all over North America, UFO conferences, just all kinds of folks have loved this film. We've played this film for the Pacific Northwest Historical Society. I mean, this has an audience outside of ufology, which has been really fun for us. And the reason for that is when we went into making the film and telling this story, which you'll see as a 1947 story about an alleged UFO sighting in our neighborhood, right off of our shores in Des Moines, between Des Moines and Maury Island, hence the name Maury Island Incident. When we came across the story for the first time in 2012, having never heard it, I actually live in a neighborhood that looks right across Puget Sound at Maury Island. I'd lived there for decades and had never heard the story that is in the film that you're going to see tonight, which just really kind of blew my mind. And when we learned more and learned more and learned more about this story and kind of fell in love with it as filmmakers, Scott Schaefer, the director, and me as a screenwriter, John White as the executive producer, what really enthralled us was the amazing documentary record that we had available to us from 1947 from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Because as you'll see in the bookends, in the way we structure the movie, is a bookend scene that takes place in J. Edgar Hoover's office with his field agent, a man in real life named Jack Wilcox, and he is our Agent Mulder. So if you want to think of the TV series The X-Files, the special agent of the FBI that you'll see depicted here is based on Jack Wilcox, and this is literally history's first X-File. It is the story of a crashed airplane that was carrying alleged alien UFO cargo that was investigated by a special agent from the FBI. And if that doesn't sound like an X-File, I don't know what is. We love this story. We were excited to be able to make a 30-minute film, and that it's been well received. It's not a documentary. It's not a reenactment. It hopefully feels like you're in a theater, which you are, as it turns out, that you paid for a ticket, which you did, as it turns out, and that it feels right, that it feels like it's a Hollywood level of quality, even if it's 30 minutes. So I hope you really, really do enjoy it. Before it starts, I want to say this. It's Alien Open Mic. I have not, as a storyteller, as a filmmaker, I have not encountered an alien myself. I have not had a sighting myself, so I don't fall into the category of, I guess, experiencer. But I think I fall in a different category, which is relevant, which is, I think there are millions of us, tens of millions of us, that have heard a story. It might be a UFO story, it might be some other paranormal story, and then they just got the itch to know more. And that's the rabbit hole that we go down and get excited. And then we find things that are true and things we can't explain. And that's both exciting and sort of triggers that natural human treasure hunt instinct that I think we all have, to kick that rock, see what's underneath it, and pull the thread on history, which is what we've done with the movie. And I just hope you enjoy it, have a good time. I'll come back and talk with you in a half an hour. And if Charles is watching with those bright God lights, as they say, I guess it's time to roll the film. Thank you, everybody.
Let's try this. You tell me when I say something that isn't true. 6 flying discs, maybe 100 feet across, hollow, in the center. One of them is failing. You wonder if it'll crash into your boat. It happens very fast. You can feel it, like a bomb.
Well, thank you for sitting through a 30-minute short film. That's what we call a long short in film world. I'll say a few things. I haven't sat, usually when we screen the film, it starts running and it turns out I've seen it many times. And so I skate out for 20 minutes and come back, and my wife is here, Melody, and we sat through the whole thing, and it's just fun to see it in the theater. So thank you for joining me in seeing the film tonight in a theatrical setting. Super fun. Couple things I want to share, and then take questions for sure if there are any, and then we can get to the open mic, which is the real important part. But I'll share this. Almost all of that film is based on Agent Jack Wilcox's daily records of his investigation of this B-25 plane crash. It's an incredible historical record. And it was so much fun to research this and discover these documents, which, you know, if you go online today and you go to Wikipedia when you go home tonight, you're going to see the entry says Maury Island Hoax, because there's a whole industry of skeptics out there that don't care. He was so frightened of public ridicule in 1947 for allegedly seeing something that he instead chose to invent a lie, which was, I just made it all up. And that's the story that drove the narrative for 50 plus years, until the records were released, until people started to read them. And, you know, goofy filmmakers like me and my partners decided there was a real story here to share. So most of what you see, there are about 3 things that we completely invented for fun. You can guess what they are. But the rest of it, Hoover's involvement, the things he said, what he was mad about, the agent's report, the dog was killed on the boat and they threw it overboard. All of that is right out of the records. We tried to stick as closely to those reports as we could because they were really unbelievable. We just couldn't believe we didn't know this amazing story. So that's, I guess, all I'll say. I can't see very well. You might have to shout out if you have a question. Does anybody have a question or a comment or a complaint? Management, I'll be management. You can complain to me. Anybody? I think we're good. Oh, yes, there's one, yes. Yeah, so I'll repeat it so you can hear it. The question is, if there were 6 discs and one was lower than the others and was having this problem, in the records and all the interviews and all the FBI records, it's described as first what happened, it was lower than the others over the boat. Didn't feel like it was targeting, it was just randomly, that's where it was. First thing that came out of it was, they call it a chaff. I always thought of it like you're at a bonfire and you started it with newspapers and there's that kind of flaming paper type chaff. That's what it was described as. And so that wasn't scary, it was just, the whole thing was strange. But then that disc allegedly had an explosion, and they said it was raining a fiery material. They were shorthanding it at the time, apparently, and later as slag. So it was like a molten material, which is causing the damage to the boat. And again, it was much lower. Some reports you will read who are really shoddy in the reporting suggest that it crashed. It did not. For whatever reason, it did not crash. Some of the reports and stories say that another one of the discs actually came down to it and touched it, which seemed to change everything before they all went away. But all of the FBI reporting on Harold Dahl's story suggests that it didn't crash and that they all went away, and that's really all we know. So that's what we know about that. Another question, I see another hand, yes. So you probably, because that's a good voice, you probably heard that, but basically the question is, the film depicts this fiery explosion and slag material dropping, and that suggests a fuel as fuel for that fire and explosion. And would it have not perhaps been electronic? So first of all, that's more engineering than I have experience, so that's good thinking on your part. Second is we documented that out of the records. So those are the Harold Dahl explanations and interviews with the FBI described it that way. Yeah. Charles, the son, was never on the record on this, so it wasn't like he sometime later explained things differently. And the two dock workers, probably isn't clear just from the movie, they picked up that morning 2 workers off the docks in Tacoma, and just day workers. And so we know there are these 4 people and the dog on the boat, and we have no idea what happened to those 2 workers. So they were, we have no names. They just disappear into history. They don't, other than sort of figures in the story, they don't contribute. We have nothing on them. So we tried. We didn't try to. In fact, it may not be something that you would think about, but we were very intentional to show, when we chose to show in the film the flying discs and what happened. Think about how we chose to show it to illustrate what the man in black was saying at the theater. At the diner. And the idea there was we as filmmakers weren't going to second guess or interpret or make a claim as to what happened. What we wanted to do was show an audience exactly what the man in black was saying. That's when we inserted it. So it was kind of like his story is what we were showing you, not our opinion on what happened. So again, it goes back to your question. We tried to get that piece as accurate as possible to the records that we had. Okay, I'm looking, I see another question, yes. Charles, the son, is not alive. He passed, and I'm gonna say, I think in the 1970s, he had moved to Louisiana. One of the follow-up questions is often, was he ever interviewed? Did he ever go on the record? And there's everything about this story ends up with the adjective murky, right? It just eventually gets murky about what went on. Charles gave one interview, apparently. In that interview, at some point, he said, well, my dad made it all up. Skeptics immediately jumped on that and said, aha, Maury Island is a hoax, because Charles, the son, said dad made it all up. Those skeptics not really thinking about what was the entire family secret agreement, was that dad made it all up. That's the family story. We're going to be hoaxsters, not experiencers, right? That was what the family and what Charles decided in 1947. So if Charles says in 1960, my dad made it all up, all Charles is doing what he and the family had agreed to do. So maybe that's a little hard to follow, but it's a classic Hollywood family secret, right? And so Charles shouldn't have said it wasn't made up if in fact his dad was still alive, and the idea was dad did not want to be deemed crazy. He'd rather be a liar. So that is, again, it's murky when you get into Maury Island history. Best I can do answering that question. I see a hand up maybe in the back middle. Yes. So remember that second question, because I'll forget it. I want to come back to it. Okay. So first question is 2 p.m, and boy, a lot of people are around. How many people do you think lived on Maury Island in 1947? Like under 1,000 people are there on the whole island. In the city of Des Moines, where I live, which looks at it, is about 3,000 people. It's 35,000 today. So a lot of people is a relative term, so that's one thing to consider. And the thing I always say, and I don't want to make light of that question because I think it's super relevant. If something happens, who can see it and who saw it? I have lived and had this view across to Maury Island from our neighborhood for about 30 years. I've been told by reliable sources that there's a thing called an orca. Seriously, I've been told this. I have never seen it, therefore it doesn't exist, right? I really, the question, when I think about someone should have seen it, I agree with that concept, except people don't see things unless they're right there. So that's one thought. We did meet somebody who lived in the Redondo area, and apparently in that community, they all remember the sound of an explosion at that point in time. Not all. There are people that remember that there was some big explosion off in the water that everybody was talking about. They couldn't explain it. I'm like, okay, maybe that's corroboration. The most interesting thing was, to me, was there is it's the National UFO Reporting Center, Newfork. And it's a great place to look for just sightings. And going back to the newspaper question, great place because it's so detailed. And what they basically do is if someone sees something or they saw something historically and they finally want to talk about it, they can call and they can make a report. And without judgment, that report just goes into the database, right? So I'm thinking, in light of your good question, I want to see if someone else reported something back in June 21st, of 1947. And I learn about this database, and I've been looking at all the newspapers, and I'm seeing all kinds of reports in the Seattle area. That was happening like crazy. Lots of newspapers in the Pacific Northwest during this period. This whole summer is called the Summer of the Saucers. There's thousands of sightings during this summer. And I get into those records, and I look, and there's nothing. I'm like, shoot, that would have been so cool if in June of 1947, Newfork had other reports of a sighting. And I just let it go. And then several years later, for whatever reason, I looked again. And what they did have at Newfork was they had reports in May of 1947. They had reports in, I think, July of 1947. They had reports in August of 1947. And these are reports that are like, I was in the Point Ruston area, which looks right at Maury Island, right, just south to north. And these were good reports, but they're not the right time. And so then I started to look at what does Newfork do when they take a report? And what I learned what was interesting was they don't judge it, they don't guess it. And so the people that when you go to the actual report made by the people aren't saying May or August or July. What the people that report say, this happened in the summer of 1947, that this thing happened that I saw. And it's the person that takes the report who has no more information than that has to pick a month for that sighting, which has nothing to do with the report. It's just they have to fill in the field. And so they say, if the report says summer, if that person taking the report is deciding I'll just put May, then it's May, but we know it's not May. So there are about 5 sightings that appear to me to be potentially corroborating sightings that people have discussed at Newfork, because we actually don't know what time in 1947 they happened in that area. So I think that's another interesting thing. We're still working. We're waiting for witnesses to come forward. They still do. For example, they'll give you an example. That piece of slag you see in the movie, that slag was the actual slag found by Elmer Frombach, who approached us while we were filming. Came out of the woodwork. We'd never heard of him. We'd never heard of this part of the story. He came out. He actually signed a statement for us that he found that piece of slag. They used to camp on that beach at Maury Island every summer, and they would hunt for this stuff because they all knew the story, and he found this stuff in the trees, and he kept some. And that's where that part of the story came from. We thought that was amazing because stuff in trees doesn't climb from the ground. It comes from somewhere up there. We thought that was a really fun thing to learn. We're always learning more about the story. So long-winded answer. Second question was about the plane, right? So yes, all good information. Isn't this great? There's so much we can't even get into the story. So the Maury Island sighting allegedly happens on June 21 of 1947. 3 days later, as the gentleman references, Kenneth Arnold is flying a plane around Mount Rainier. This is June 24th. And he's a very credible commercial pilot, and he's just got some extra time, and he's flying around, and he is looking for a crashed airplane. It's not the same plane in our story. This plane crashed the year before and hadn't been located. It was a military aircraft, and there was a number of people that died on it. And it was just a lost, crashed plane. And so pilots would, if they had extra time, fly around Mount Rainier and look for it. And that, on June 24th, is when Kenneth Arnold had his very, very famous sighting, one of the most famous sightings in UFO history, nine discs. That sighting is where the term flying saucer got coined by a reporter, actually, but from that particular sighting. So the crash that we have in the movie that happened later was a crash of our investigators that were investigating Maury Island. They were from the Army, and that happened on August 1 of 1947. Another small piece of information, those two pilots, Captain Davidson and Lieutenant Brown, who died on August 1st, 1947, piloting that airplane, who had just investigated Maury Island and had samples of the slag in the plane. That plane crashed on August 1. That was the first day that the Air Force separated from the Army. It's called Air Force Day. They'd been one branch of the military, now there are two. So Brown and Davidson are the first two fatalities in the history of the United States Air Force, dying while they were on active duty, which is kind of remarkable. Air Force doesn't like to talk about that because they think it's kind of a sideshow, but it's kind of a shame because they died doing their duty, which is too bad, of course, tragic. But despite efforts to kind of put a marker up, recognize that, there hasn't been any success or recognition. Okay, any more questions? Because I know we got to, okay, should we take one more? So question is essentially about J. Edgar Hoover's role. How interested was he in finding this Men in Black? And the connection between sort of that whole process and the UFOs. To me, as a historian, a researcher, a writer, one of the most amazing discoveries for me was the direct involvement of Hoover in the Maury Island investigation. If you go through all these FBI records, and I would encourage you to do it, they're available. You can find them now. Hoover, Hoover in 1947 was at the height of his power. Just come out of World War II. He might have been the most powerful individual in the world in June of 1947. He had been directing the FBI for decades and decades and decades. And as you probably all know, Hoover was also starting to do a lot of very bad things, starting to monitor citizen groups and figure out which type of Americans were the right kind of Americans. And that was pretty nasty. And he was starting to monitor the civil, just a lot of bad stuff, a lot of weird stuff. Turns out he was extremely interested in the UFO phenomenon in the summer of 1947. So maybe that was another thing that he, that doesn't get a lot of press, but he really, I'll use the word, he really dug it. He was into it. He was involved in so many of these UFO investigations. And in the summer of 1947, he was directly in conflict with the Army over this jurisdiction question. Hoover was so into it, he did not want the Army to be conducting any of these investigations. And they had, I always say flaming emails. Of course, we didn't have email back then. The aliens hadn't brought it to us until 1947. So they teletyping, right? They were memoing back and forth. In the summer of 1947, General Shulgren from the Army and Hoover, these are just shouting match teletypes about I'm, you can't, I can. I mean, Hoover was saying things like, okay, fine, if you catch them in the air, they're yours, right? Just like flippantly saying, but anything on the ground is mine. And it was really kind of a shouting match. And then all of a sudden, late in the summer, Hoover does a 180-degree turn. And he just says, and you saw the directive, that is, all those documents you saw, those are real FBI documents in the film. Those are all not just made up props. We just made copies of the real deal and made them look fresh. And that directive that comes into the scene is a real directive. When Hoover finally decides that he's saying, screw it, it's not that I'm not gonna fight you anymore. I'm not gonna give you a single resource from the FBI. That's how mad I am. You are on your own. And he knew that the Army and the Air Force could never really do much with it without his support, and he withdrew it all. I don't have a great connection between him and the concept of the Men in Black. What we really fell in love with, though, was Hoover's actual membership in the Masonic Order. And we have a lot of detail in the movie that you wouldn't have picked up, but Hoover was a 33rd degree Master Mason. And if you really get into the history of the Masons, that's a pretty big deal. And if you really get into the history of the Masons, and you really get into the schisms that happened between factions of the Masons, this whole notion of deciding that that's the point that you are sure that your government isn't doing the job you want them to do, that you're basically authorized to go off book and do things, it all plays out historically in that order. And Hoover would have been the most well-positioned to do something like do off-book operations. We know he did. We know he did all the time. So we in the movie decided it was probably worth introducing, at least conceptually, the notion that Hoover may not have known who that one individual was, but he wasn't opposed to the whole idea of an off-book group doing things like the Men in Black. And maybe one of the points that we were most in love with in the movie is, no matter what you think happened at Maury Island, we don't have to decide what happened at Maury Island. The things that we know did happen historically are so amazing. And one of them was the introduction of the whole concept of the Men in Black. That hadn't happened until June 22nd, 1947. And so even if Harold Dahl made the whole story up, including making up that a Men in Black visited him, that story led to The X-Files, led to Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. All of that comes from June 22nd, 1947. It's the stone in the water, and the ripple went out from there. So we're just like, this story needs to be told, and no matter how we tell it, it's an important and interesting historical and cultural event. So that's okay. I got one more hand, and that's it. You can retire your hands until it's time for, because I want to make sure we have time for your open mic night for sure. One more question, yes. Yeah. So the slag we show in the movie was actually the slag that Elmer Frombach brought to us, that he says that he recovered in the 60s when he was camping on the beach and found it in the tree. He actually had brought it to a place called the Museum of the Mysteries, and they displayed it in a case for a while. And then we knew them, but Elmer came to us and said, hey, I have this thing and it's over there, you should go get it. And we were like, oh, okay. Then we were like, can we use it in the movie? That'd be fun. Like have the real prop, your real prop in the movie. We made him sign a statement that he was telling us the truth about every part of his story, about where it came from, the authenticity. A follow-up question we often get, has the slag been tested? Right, natural question. To our knowledge, it hasn't. There was some, I said everything is murky. We don't own the slag. We don't have control of it. The Museum of the Mysteries does. I think at some point they probably will. There's just been a lot of controversy. They had somebody come look at it, and it was kind of this dubious, wasn't clear what kind of scientific analysis. I'm a big fan of having a documentary and finding out what it is at the end of the documentary. I mean, that'd be super fun. But it's up to them to decide if and when they choose to do that. And the other thing I'm sort of a realist about is I don't know really what it means. If someone were to test it and say, you can find all those elements on this planet, I don't know what that means, because I think all the elements on this planet are elements that are a lot of places in space. I don't really know what that means. If you found something that wasn't from this planet, that'd be interesting. But if there's nothing that's not from this planet, I don't think it rules anything out either. So that's kind of where that has landed. Okay, I'm going to call that last question. I want to say thanks for what great questions and watching a long short. I appreciate it.